Okay, well, it's 12:05. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Richard Kravitz, Director at UC Center Sacramento. This is the UC Center Sacramento Speaker Series, and welcome. This is the fifth talk of winter quarter. And with this one, we depart in a couple of ways from our usual procedures. For one thing, the topic moves aside just a bit from our 2021-22 theme of emerging from the pandemic, promoting health and prosperity for all Californians in the wake of COVID-19. And for another, we have three presentations, not just one, and we'll be going till almost 1:30 p.m. So the reason for the departure is a pretty good one. This is the one session per year that we've set aside to hear about some of the exciting policy relevant research conducted by graduate students enrolled at the University of California. And here to introduce today's program is one of those students, the UC Center's own Sharif Amlani. Sharif is a graduate student in political science at UC Davis and a graduate student researcher at UCCS. His own work focuses on the impact of money in politics. And aside from his academic work, he has, along with UCCS professor Ross Butters, published several articles in the Washington Post blog on topics related to social networks, polarization, and COVID-19. Before I turn it over to Sharif, just one word about questions. There will be an opportunity to ask the panelists questions at the end of the three presentations, but also feel free to type in your questions using the Q&A feature in Zoom, just to indicate which of the panelists you're directing that question to. And so now, without any further ado, at least not from me, I'll turn it over to Sharif.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Kravitz. And good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sharif Amlani, and I am the graduate student researcher here at UCCS. It is a pleasure to have you all with us today for our 2021 Emerging Scholars Panel. This special UCCS speaker series features the three top submissions from the 2021 UCCS Emerging Scholars Award competition. Each year since 2017, UCCS has invited graduate students from all 10 UC campuses to submit synopses of their policy relevant research. Winners are chosen by a panel of UCCS affiliated faculty, graduate students, and policy consultants. Up to 3 candidates are chosen for the award based on research excellence and relevance to public policy in California. This year, we have 3 outstanding recipients of the award: Zoe Gutman, Melissa Cronin, and Sam Trackman. Zoe Gutman graduated with her PhD in neuroscience from UCLA and is currently a Science and Technology Policy Fellow with the California Council on Science and Technology in the Office of State Senator Anthony Portantino. She studied the intersection of behavioral economics with cognitive science and addiction, while also exploring how green spaces can positively impact communities' health and safety. She urges municipal governments to consider the evidence in favor of green spaces and direct funding to enhance these spaces in underserved neighborhoods. Melissa Cronin is a PhD candidate in the Conservation Action Lab at UC Santa Cruz. Her research focuses on mapping and mitigating shark and devil ray bycatch in industrial fisheries, where she quantifies the impact of fishing on these species and develops conservation solutions. She is a co-founder and project leader of the Mobula Conservation Project, at an organization dedicated to the research and conservation of manatee and devil rays in Eastern Pacific Oceans. Sam Trackman is a postdoctoral fellow for the American Political Economy Project at UC Berkeley, where he also completed his PhD in political science in 2021. He studies the politics of policy reform in the United States, especially with respect to decarbonization. His research has been published broadly in major political science journals, including the American Political Science Review. Today, he explores how state and local level public policies can contribute to decarbonization in the US economy. Congratulations to each of our Emerging Scholars Award recipients. We are very proud of you and enthusiastic about your research, especially its potential applications to public policy. Our talk today will begin with Zoe Gutman and then Melissa Cronin, and we'll finish with Samuel Trackman. With that, please welcome Zoe Gutman.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction, Sharif. You're making me laugh. It's great. Yeah, I'm so happy to be here today. It's such an honor to be invited to give this talk. I'll start right away because I don't want to go over time. As Sharif mentioned, so my PhD was in neuroscience. So what I'm going to be talking about is not exactly my main focus of research or of my thesis work. It was a project that we had on the side. I'm going to talk about urban greening and as how it can act as an alternative mechanism to address public health and safety in underserved communities. The reason we decided to focus on urban greening is because it's pretty widely acknowledged to improve public health, but it also may be a cost-effective public safety measure. And the reason we found that kind of interesting is because things like community health and safety are increasingly understood to be really intertwined with kind of quality of life measures, but they're often appraised and budgeted independently. So I think to identify efficient interventions that can benefit community, thinking of these things as more intertwined and holistic can benefit, can find, great solutions. So just a little overview of my talk today. I'm going to start with just a little overview of urban green spaces. Then I'll talk about how they can affect public health and safety, how they can also influence extreme heat and air pollution, and then I'll go into the current status of kind of funding mechanisms and some issues with that, and how we can move forward to find potential solutions and maybe some alternative funding sources. So the paper that we published about this focused on Los Angeles, but I think it's pretty generalizable across California, but some of the statistics are LA specific. So when we talk about green spaces, we refer to a range of media that incorporates nature into urban settings. So that's not only trees, it can be planting along sidewalks, community gardens, things like that. And I think when people think of California or LA, they think of, all this greenery, but we're actually 65th in Los Angeles out of the 100 largest cities in the Trust for Public Lands National Park ranking, which the park score ranking is kind of this like gold standard in comparing parks. It has to do with access to park, investments in parks, the amenities that are there, how big they are. I think they just added equity in their for their new upcoming statistics, but this doesn't include that. So we're 65th, that's not a great number. Only half of residents of LA County live within walking distance of a park, and less than half of those people have parks that are in good conditions, and 80% of those experience overcrowding. So unsurprisingly, as I think you would assume, parks and greenery is not randomly distributed. It really falls along socioeconomic and racial lines. Historically, whiter, wealthier neighborhoods benefited from investment in trees and parks and other sorts of greenery. Therefore, lack of accessibility to nature is pretty apparent in low-income and non-white communities, and there's a lot of data around that. They not only have lower quantity, but also lower quality of green spaces, and a lot of research shows that it's not necessarily the existence of a park, but it's it's the quality of that park. So is there walkability? Are there appealing features? Is it well upkept? If there's a park that's really overgrown and kind of messy and not that enjoyable to be in, it can actually cause more harm than good. I just pulled one statistic around this just to kind of show, I don't know if you can see my mouse. Can you? Whatever. I'm gonna assume you can, but so you can see on the left, they're mapping, and this is in Sacramento, so they're mapping the percentage of residents who identify as Black, and you can see the darker purple are areas that have a higher percentage, and then on the right are the percentage of tree canopy. So you can see these darker areas of purple map onto the lighter areas of green, and vice versa. So kind of neighborhoods with a higher percentage of white residents have more tree canopy, which again, I don't think surprises most people. So the reason, again, that we focus on greenery is because I think it represents a way that we can think about health in this more holistic manner. And one of the ways people do that is they talk about something called the social determinants of health. So that has to do with the conditions in which you're born, live, work, learn, kind of all these things that make up someone's life. So your education, healthcare, neighborhood built environment, social and community context, economic stabilities, all of these are now understood to really contribute to what we think of as health. And then of course that contributes to quality of life measures like your educational attainment, your income, incarceration rates. And then all of this is obviously very entwined with public safety and public health. So there's fewer quantity of these green spaces, as I said, in underserved communities, but these same communities also suffer from increased prevalence of chronic illnesses like asthma, cardiovascular disease, depression. They tend to be more safe despite more policing. And I think recently these issues were really brought to light with the COVID-19 pandemic, where inequalities and access to nature were experienced by those in these underserved or marginalized neighborhoods. So I think, local legislators and policymakers focus on trying to reconcile these social and racial disparities, but incorporating relevant science on solutions that might be efficient but unconventional, like greenery, I think provides an opportunity. Sorry if you can hear my desktop over here getting all these emails. One measure that has, turns out, a measurable effect on health is urban greenery. So I do not have time to go into the mounds of data around this. So I'll give a little summary of what we found to be the most rigorous and reproducible effects of greenery. So a bunch of studies have found relationships between increased access to nature and lower risk of all-cause mortality. So that means mortality from non-accidental causes. Also lower rates of mental illness. There was some studies found relationships with anxiety and depression, reductions in obesity, mostly through higher physical activity. Some research suggests that greenery is protective against cardiovascular disease, mental resilience, stress alleviation. I think a lot of these are kind of intuitive, and if you would kind of think deeply about, or for a moment, about what you get from kind of being in nature, I think it's pretty intuitive. There's a lot of data around maternal health and birth outcomes. I'm going to use that as an example in the next slide to go into a little more of this, child and adolescent development, and even amelioration of pathologies like dementia and ADHD. There's studies on symptoms of dementia and ADHD can improve when taking a walk in nature or being more around greenery. So as I said, I'm just going to go through one of these studies really quickly just to show the effects. So this study looked at birth records in California for 3.7 million births between 2001 and 2008. They looked at green spaces and air pollution. And of course, I should have mentioned this earlier, all of these studies are obviously controlling for things like socioeconomic status, median household income, education. It's not just that these studies are finding that in wealthier neighborhoods, there's better health outcomes. They're controlling for those types of covariates or mediating factors. So this study found exposure to residential green space was associated with a decreased risk of preterm birth. But what they found, which I think is really interesting, is there was this synergistic effect with air pollution. So what that suggests is that increasing exposure to green spaces might be more beneficial for women and for pregnancy outcomes who are exposed to high air pollution during their pregnancy. So it suggests that the greatest impact of green spaces is in these low socioeconomic areas that also suffer from disparities in community health and safety already. There's a lot of data also around child and adolescent development, which I think is really interesting. We just chose in the paper, and then I chose even fewer for here, but the ones that I thought were the most rigorous and most interesting. But this is a study on high school students that found students attending schools in greener settings had higher test scores, higher graduation rates, more plans to attend college, and fewer criminal behaviors. And this, of course, is also controlling for socioeconomic status and controlling for things like enrollment size and things like that. So it's not just that they're like, better schools or more funded schools. Other studies have found outdoor playtime improves mental well-being through social connection, physical connectivity. Encouraging outdoor activities is also really important for mental health. And for things like ADHD, there's a number of studies showing that children with ADHD learn better and have less symptoms when they're in more natural environments. One other pretty robust finding is regarding screen and non-screen activities in children. So this isn't directly Greenery, but obviously a lot of non-screen activities for children happen outside or in parks or, with friends in the playground and things like that, which is related to a number of mental health and outcomes of mental illness. So I hope I've convinced you in my very brief time that, sorry, that's just the phone ringing, that at the very least, urban greenery is related to health. I'm sorry, is related to physical and mental health. And it's pretty meaningful in terms of development and quality of life measures. And that means that disparities in greenery can also affect those same measures. And to me, when I read this kind of research, the question arises of how is this happening? What are the mechanisms through which greenery is affecting all of these health outcomes? Is it just that, someone is walking more in a park and therefore they're healthier, or like what exactly is happening? And that's a huge component of why we wanted to focus on this, because I think the research suggests that the mechanisms through which urban greenery affects health are many of the root causes of disparities in other community metrics like community safety that go beyond health. So, lots of research suggests that green spaces mediate improvements in health through various different mechanisms that go way beyond socioeconomic variables. So adding trails to parks and things like that can encourage exercise, which produces serotonin and enhances mental acuity, promotes resilience. It also has mitigation of noise pollution, which can reduce, stress and provide, mental restoration. There's also improvements to kind of collective ownership over communities and social cohesion, and this idea of like collective efficacy if you're spending more time, greater street activity and more use of these like collective green spaces. Greenery also eliminates pollutants from the air and can provide relief from heat, especially extreme heat, which I'll talk about in a little while too. So what we're trying to emphasize is that these benefits that have been shown to accompany urban greening, they don't act in a vacuum, right? So they affect all aspects of life, including those social determinants of health that I spoke about at the beginning. So these contributions that urban greenery can provide to things like resilience, mental acuity, social cohesion can lay the foundation for long-term health benefits, but also for to address these disparities in things like quality of life, well-being, economic prospects, and potentially reduce criminal behavior because many of these driving factors are similar. So this does need more research, but I think there are a few studies that support this idea and shed light on some of the mechanisms. I'm just keeping an eye on my time. Okay. So there's a couple studies linking greenery to criminal behavior. So one study looked at crime rates for 98 apartment buildings that had various levels of nearby vegetation. And they found that the greener the buildings surrounding, the fewer property crimes and violent crimes were reported, of course, controlling for socioeconomic variables and things like that. Another study looked at the percentage of tree canopy, and they found lower rates of assault, battery, robbery, and narcotics crimes. This was a randomized control trial, which I think if this research is to continue, we need to have more of these types of studies that are not just correlational, but these researchers randomly allocated 2 vacant lots to either a greening intervention or a control condition. So in one of those conditions, they cleaned up the lots. They did things like planted additional like grass, not only trees like, grass, shrubs, things like that. They cleaned them up. they built, I think, some like wooden fences around the perimeter and things like that. And they found the, improvements not only in the perception of safety, but also in gun crimes and police reported crimes in the neighborhood. So I'm not going to go into this too in depth, but another thing that really affects crime rates is heat and air pollution. And this is, a whole area of study in itself, but just so we all have kind of equal levels of background, I just wanted to point out that high temperatures, high air pollution have been correlated with a number of detrimental outcomes, including violent crime, mortality and morbidity, negative mood, interpersonal conflict, and mental illness and suicide. And the reason this is important is because, as I mentioned, greenery can significantly influence heat and pollution. That's one of its main benefits. So greenery can provide shade and cooling, even in microclimates like parking lots. It eliminates pollutants from the air. And because of this, it is suspected to have the greatest benefits in these historically marginalized neighborhoods, which might also suffer from lack of air conditioning, things like that. I don't think, again, it's a surprise to anyone listening that the neighborhoods that suffer from extreme heat and pollution tend to also be stratified by racial and socioeconomic lines. There's much higher deaths attributed to heat or pollution in low-income and non-white Americans and neighborhoods. They tend to live, there are these neighborhoods that are, it's called urban heat islands, where there's a lot of concrete and not a lot of counteraction by shade. So there's an extreme amount of heat. And a lot of these neighborhoods and these disparities stem from structural issues, from racially motivated policies like redlining, which were different policies that denied mortgages, loans, and government services to purposefully marginalize predominantly Black neighborhoods. There's a lot of data on redlined neighborhoods because you can look at where these lines were and look at the health and safety outcomes within them. So continued to this day in LA, these neighborhoods are still majority non-white. They still have more air pollution. They're up to 7 degrees hotter, which is wild, and a number that is projected to increase. In LA, majority white neighborhoods have 3 times the tree canopy and half of the heat absorbing surfaces compared to majority Black communities. It's a huge disparity. This has measurable effects. So during heat waves, Black Angelenos were 2 times as likely to die compared to other residents, many more emergency room visits and things like that. So the last thing I'll say about heat and pollution is that it also affects this kind of holistic view of health, right? So there's a decrease in productivity and family income. There's studies showing this. If you can think about when you're really hot, your kind of physiological response is to slow down. You might work less and take more frequent breaks. It's not exactly conducive to mental acuity, and that can harm achievement and academic prospects. So warmer temperatures and heightened air pollution has been linked to damaged cognition in adults and children. There was an analysis of student test scores that demonstrated that every additional degree of heat translated to 1% less learning, and the trend disproportionately affected minority students and accounted for 5% of the racial achievement gap, which is huge. So clearly, greenery has these quantifiable benefits, not only to health, but also to kind of these underlying factors, these like social determinants of health that really influence life. So better physical health, mental health, healthier mothers and children, relief from heat and air pollution, and potentially lower aggression and criminal behaviors. So what is the current status of how greenery, I'm not going to go into this too much because I don't have the time, but to kind of just quickly, how is greenery funded? So it's mostly funded by these local sources, which can be difficult to secure long-term funding. Also, as trends in the last couple of decades, a lot of green money for green spaces were among the first cut with kind of fiscal austerity measures. Property taxes is another way they're funded, but of course, this is a huge issue in low-income areas. There are grants that can counteract budget cuts or the effect of relying on property taxes, but a lot of these grants go to areas that are competitive in grant writing, which tend to not necessarily be these underserved neighborhoods. There's also sources like, the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which funds a huge amount of these projects, but it relies on matching by state and local contributions, which again, in these lower income neighborhoods is not necessarily, sometimes can exclude them from these types of funding mechanisms. There's also city budgets and state budgets. Most recently, the governor's budget gave, I think it was 100 million to cool communities through nature-based solutions, and that includes tree canopy and things like that. Sorry, just my computer. And then there's also legislation. So there's something called Measure A in LA, and a lot more of this has come out since we published this paper, which is great and definitely in the right direction. There's the LA Green New Deal, which has a lot about greenery in there, but I'm going to talk a little bit now about the issues in those mechanisms. So with those mechanisms. So one problem that a lot of critics bring up is that while there frequently is input from stakeholders and local organizations, they tend to be brought in later stages of decision making. And there's also a lack of transparency and details around the actual implementation of the budget, especially in the LA Green New Deal. So there's not that much detail on how the development will actually occur and how these underserved communities can provide ongoing input as this is happening to avoid things like gentrification and other kind of harmful effects that increased greenery can have. Also, a lot of the focus on this type of these types of interventions are on trees, but non-tree interventions are also really effective and can sometimes be better to avoid things like gentrification around a centralized location. Maintenance is a huge issue. As I said, if you can add a bunch of new parks or trees, but if they're not well maintained, they're not really going to have the same effects on health and safety that or benefits to those things. I'm almost out of time. And the other problem is that some people argue that LA has this history of kind of this sweeping, ambitious long-term legislation that can fall short of their goals and kind of be at the whim of public opinion or the administration when kind of immediate shorter term solutions might be needed. So some potential solutions are, so that's saying focus on environmental justice and community involvement. So local organizations and stakeholders can be brought in from the ground up to guide choices and given like really, the actual decision-making power to avoid gentrification and displacement, because what you don't want is to add a bunch of greenery and then have, the local residents be priced out or something from gentrification. That's the opposite of what the goals are of this. And there are ways to do that. There's things like community benefit agreements and things like that, I'm out of time, so I can't go into. There's also, the focus on small scale, low cost, efficient changes like greening walkway, community gardens, things like that, that can reduce gentrification. And what we're kind of suggesting in our paper, and this is the last thing I'll say, is that maybe alternative funding sources are needed because you don't want to be taking funding from other community health measures. It might be time to consider kind of some other sources. And one area that gets a huge amount of budget and investment are community safety budgets. So a robust body of evidence at this point demonstrates that there's this huge budgeting disparity between the benefits of between public safety departments and kind of their proportional improvement to safety. Since inequalities in green spaces are largely due to this history of kind of structural inequalities that are inherent to policies, reappropriating some of those funds would help restore trust, counter historic injustices, and begin to address the root causes of disparities in public health and safety. So that's kind of what we're recommending in this paper. And there's a lot of data around the lack of correlation between increased budgets for, and this is, we're not saying to like, defund or anything like that. We're just saying to reallocate part of this funding that it might have reached a point of diminishing returns where increased funding for some alternative solutions might aid community safety. So as public opinion moved towards alternative mechanisms of public safety, urban greenery could be prioritized as an unconventional but data-driven solution. So, I'm kind of skipping through the end here because I ran out of time, but I'm happy to talk more about this if anyone is interested and kind of provide more of this data, but I'll just end by saying, it's long evident that the canonical approach to public safety has come at an enormous cost to well-being of marginalized communities. And if we can shift some of this focus towards causes instead of outcomes, we can kind of address these root causes and maybe some of these alternative solutions that are driven by scientific evidence and address these historic inequalities could promote public health and at the same time public safety. So with that, I'll just thank everyone at UCCS for this great opportunity. My co-authors on this were Yuki Habner and Roshni Varma through the Science Policy Group. I also have to thank my thesis advisor and everyone at UCLA and all my funding sources that didn't fund this work, but they funded me through graduate school. So none of it would have been possible without them. And yeah, I'm happy to talk more about this with anyone who's interested offline. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Zoe, for just a fantastic talk today. And so our next speaker is going to be Melissa Cronin. And just a reminder, I do see that there's a question over in the Q&A chat. So definitely, as you think of questions for each of the speakers, go ahead and put your question in the Q&A chat. There'll also be an opportunity to kind of ask your question by raising your hand at the end of all three talks. If you do go ahead and put it in the chat, if you could just make sure to put who the question is addressed to, that'd be awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Zoe, for that really illuminating talk. That was cool to learn about. Hi, everyone. I'm Melissa Cronin. I hope that my screen looks all right. Please let me know if not, but I hope it's
great.
Great. So I'm a PhD student finishing up at UC Santa Cruz, and I'm actually a conservation ecologist by training, but I'm going to share with you some work that I've done through my thesis on policy analysis, which is a new realm for me, but has been really an enjoyable one. I want to first start by introducing you, or hopefully reintroducing you, to sharks and rays. This is a group that is obviously really iconic, but simultaneously very understudied. However, what we do know is that these species, particularly sharks, are very important predators. They maintain healthy ecosystems in many places around the world. They're also an indicator of ocean health. So a really healthy ocean ecosystem has lots of top predators and lots of sharks and rays. And finally, they're important to people. So this is just one dimension of their importance, but economically, they bring in about $300 million annually to coastal communities and more than 10,000 jobs. And these are often places where coastal communities are relying on these species and others like them for income and for livelihood. So they're very important for many reasons. However, it has been well established that these species are in decline. So this is a figure from a recent paper showing basically a proxy index for the abundance of sharks and rays globally. And what they showed that since 1970, there has been a 71% decrease in the abundance of these species. The authors attributed this to a corresponding 18-fold increase in relative fishing pressure. So we know that these species are in extreme decline, and we know that fishing is the primary driver of this. However, not all fishing is the same. And there's a lot of different estimates of this, but we think that about half of that capture, that fishing activity that impacts sharks and rays, is bycatch. And I'm going to tell you about what bycatch is. So what is bycatch? Essentially, it's anything that you capture during the fishing operation that you don't intend to capture. So some scholars will call it incidental non-target species. Basically, if you're fishing for, say, tuna and you capture a shark. We estimate that this makes up about 10% of the global marine fisheries catch, so what we take on board. However, in some fisheries, it's much, much higher. Some fisheries, it's much lower. And this bycatch has severe consequences, not only on the ecosystem because it removes some of these important predators, but it can also have socioeconomic consequences for fishers. It's a reputational risk. It can even destroy gear. So there are many reasons to try to address bycatch beyond even just the fact that it's a waste issue. And the context that I'm going to tell you a little more about this bycatch is within the industrial tuna fishing, the global industry. This is what I like to call big tuna with a capital B. This is a $42 billion industry that captures about 4 million tons of tuna annually. We as a global fishing industry, use two main methods to catch tuna. That's a purse seine, essentially a very, very large circular net. These can be, I actually calculated it recently, about 16 football fields across. So these are big nets. And long line, that's the other method of fishing for tuna. These are essentially miles of long hooked nets that catch tuna. Most of this tuna goes to canned products, shelf-stable tuna, and to high-value sushi and sashimi markets. But almost all of it is for export for high-value markets. And this is some, I'm not going to go into this, but this is some results from another part of my thesis where I looked at the global global capture of tuna, of sharks and rays in these tuna fisheries. And I found that they catch at the very least, at a minimum, we estimate about 2 million sharks and rays every year are caught in these fisheries. But it's probably much more than that. And importantly, of those species that are assessed, that for instance, we know what their population status is, about nearly 40% are overfished, suggesting that this is the primary driver of their decline. And among these species are several threatened and endangered species. So this type of fishing is problematic for sharks and rays, to say the least. But there is good news in that there is management bodies that we can look to address some of these problems. So these fisheries are managed globally by 5 main bodies. These are called regional fisheries management organizations. There's a lot of acronyms in the world of high seas fishing. So if you hear me throw around TRFMO or RFMO, I just mean the management body that governs fishing in these areas, most of which are the high seas where there's no national jurisdiction. And the important thing to note about these is that they're centralized. So they have quite high, they have jurisdiction over extremely large areas. And so it's a high opportunity for us as conservationists and as biologists to influence policy that has real impact over space. And so I'm going to talk to you about this one research question from a paper that we have been working on and is part of my dissertation. There are some other results that I'll share with you, but I'm really going to focus on this one. And that question is, so what are these RFMOs, these management bodies, doing? Really, what is the approach and what is the potential efficacy of the policy that we currently have in place for sharks and rays in these fisheries? In order to do that, I used an existing framework. If you ever have been involved in any sort of conservation prioritization or mitigation work, you might be familiar with this type of framework. Basically, it's based on the idea that you can do lots of different things as a manager, as a fisher, to reduce the impact to the ecosystem. And those things range in their likelihood of actually having the outcome that you want, which is reducing the mortality of sharks and rays. So up here, we have this avoidance. That's when you do something that actually avoids the capture in the first place. So we don't even go near the area where we know that sharks are. On the other end of the spectrum, you have research, obviously an important part of a mitigation strategy, but this doesn't affect the likelihood that a shark is captured in your net. And then in the middle, we have things that are minimizing the likelihood of capture, things that are remediating, so sort of changing the way you handle the animal on board so that it might be more likely to survive the capture, compensating for the animal's mortality. So for instance, paying to protect an important shark area. So these are all the options that one could foreseeably do to address the bycatch of sharks and rays. And so what I did was I took policies from each of these management bodies, those RFMOs that I showed you earlier, and I broke them down into this framework. Basically, I went through and coded each one of these and I put it into a bucket, either minimizing, compensation, research, etc. And I'm going to show you the results of that analysis right now. So this on the x-axis here is that type of approach, what you do in response to bycatch. And then here on the y is the count. So how often did that approach appear in these policies? And what I want to note is that, you can see, and this shouldn't really surprise anyone, but that research is a common theme through all of these policies. They're often directing us to do research, which, is a great thing. We want to have more research about these species. However, importantly, we have only 2 policies that I went through of all of the policies in all of the oceans for sharks and rays that actually mandate an avoidance approach, suggesting that there is almost no policy that guides fishers to avoid sharks and rays in really probably the world's largest source of their capture. And so this is a major problem. I'll also note, just as a sort of a peek into those policies, they are from one ocean for one species and they're not binding. And so this is a real problem, if we're thinking about a holistic or a multifaceted approach to mitigating bycatch. We're definitely seeing some underrepresentation of those policies that are more likely to actually have impact. I also put this in terms of time, so we can look over time at how these policies have been evolving. So the earliest policy that I identified was in 1995. These are relatively recent. And you can see that those policies that are more impactful, potentially, these avoidance and these minimizing policies, are really recent. In fact, the avoidance policy only was implemented in about 2015. And so this sort of policy related to avoidance, minimizing, and even for a little bit remediation are relatively recent. And so that's important for us to know in thinking about prioritizing future policies. I'm going to share with you sort of a couple other, very briefly, some findings from that work. So as I noted, I think that these gaps are real conservation opportunities for these threatened species across huge spaces. But what I found in those results I just showed you is that these policies focus on low-hanging fruit, not on reducing capture or reducing mortality. Another finding that I don't have time to go into, but that I'll just describe really briefly, is that I looked at the likelihood that earlier pre-existing research would predict whether or not a policy would be adopted for that species. So for instance, if you're interested in protecting whale shark in your fishery, is it required that you must have a research study prior to that policy for the policy to be adopted? And interestingly, this actually sort of surprised me. I found that that was not the case, that there was no correlation between the existence of earlier research and the passing of a policy. And so I think that that suggests that precautionary management, where we take, as it sounds like, take precautionary measures to protect threatened species, is really possible, and in fact is the norm in most of these management bodies. Finally, I did also in the paper identify major research, transparency, and policy gaps. Transparency for data collection and for data availability for external scientists. And I think that those are real areas for improvement. I've been working directly with those management bodies in 2 oceans to actually deliver this work and to help them make priorities for their policy setting. So that's really exciting. And I'll just note that this work is timely. Right now on the high seas, again, that area that is not under national jurisdiction, we are negotiating a large treaty on biodiversity, and this is being led by the UN. And so I think that this work is really important to point out the utility of some of these policies for setting conservation and management for sharks and rays in these high seas areas. So that's all ongoing right now. The final meeting is coming up in a few months. So something to watch, certainly. Okay, that's what I'm going to share with you from this paper. I also wanted to, because this is a California audience, I wanted to sort of talk very briefly about what's going on with sharks in California. If you do any swimming, fishing, anything in the ocean in California, you know that sharks are here, certainly, and that they're sort of part of our marine ecosystem, lucky for us. And I want to note that there has been a lot of movement recently on threats to shark fins. For instance, California banned shark finning. However, we have in San Francisco one of the 2 largest sources of demand for shark fins in the country. So it certainly has not gone away despite this ban. This is an example of a recent 2017 shipment that was seized in the Port of Oakland. And federal wildlife agents found that there were 700 bags of shark fins in this one single shipment. And this is just the ones that they found. So it's an important place to look at. Most of these fins are coming from Latin America towards Asia, but they go through the ports of LA, Long Beach, and Oakland. And so we know that California is a major node for shark fin products. And like bycatch that I talked about earlier, the shark fin demand and trade is a primary threat for these species. So it's something to kind of keep on your radar. It's a really, really important threat, and California plays a really big role. Finally, I'm going to sort of wrap up by talking about one other effort that's going on in California, which is around these nets called drift nets. These are sort of widely used, but more recently falling out of fashion nets in many places that are extremely important for bycatch. So these, as you might imagine, they're just sort of walls that sit in the ocean many miles long. They can kill sharks, sea turtles, marine mammals, dolphins, whatever, anything that swims into it. And these were used really widely, but have actually been banned in many places. Importantly, in California, we have a partial ban, but not a full ban. It's a very small fishery that still uses these drift nets. However, a bipartisan bill was reintroduced in 2021. It's passed in the Senate and is currently waiting in the House. And this is a really important bill because it would actually outlaw the use of these nets in all of California's waters, rather than a partial ban. And so this is really important. If you have any interest, I'm happy to talk more about this and or send you in the right way, but it's a really exciting thing. And as in many environmental cases, California is really providing a model to other areas, other jurisdictions that use this type of net. And the important thing in a lot of conservation work and a lot of the work I do is that we don't want to just ban things and leave fishers with no source of livelihood or no income. And something cool that I have not been personally involved with, but I want to point out as a great example that I see of really innovative conservation work in this sphere is the development of new technology to actually replace some of these more destructive fishing methods. So this is a picture of what's called a deep set buoy. It's essentially a more selective fishing gear for swordfish specifically, which previously those drift nets were used to catch. And what it does is it uses this long hooked line that is set at depth. That's really important, especially for swordfish, which like cold waters. So you can actually put the bait and the hook at the depth that you want that the species that you want lives at, rather than an indiscriminate net that's going to catch sort of everything it passes by. And so that's a really promising thing. This is being led by the Nature Conservancy and some other groups. And essentially they're positing this as a method to replace those destructive fishing nets. With that, I want to wrap up by thanking UCCS, the staff who have been really wonderful and helpful through this whole thing. I'm very honored to be here, especially among these great other presenters. And I wanted to thank Dr. Kravitz, Dr. Simmons, and Sandra for their great help along the way. I'd be happy to answer any more questions about this or any of my other work, which also deals with sharks and rays in large-scale tuna fisheries using a lot of different methods. So with that, thank you so much, and I look forward to discussing more.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for just a fantastic talk today, Melissa. And then our next speaker is Samuel Trachtman.
Great, thank you. Sharing my screen. Well, it's a pleasure to be here and also to have heard these really interesting presentations that are far afield from my work, and it's I've learned a lot so far, and I hope other people are as well. So I'm Sam Trachtman. I'm a postdoc at UC Berkeley for the Consortium on the American Political Economy, and today I'm going to talk about how state governments can contribute to building winning climate coalitions. So, as everyone here is probably well aware, climate change is a problem of global scope. The severity, for instance, of wildfires that we experience here in California depends just so much on the burning of fossil fuels on the highways of Beijing as on the highways of the Bay Area. And as you know, this is one of the reasons that climate change is such a difficult political problem to deal with. And because of this kind of the global nature of the problem and the collective action framing of climate change, scholars and practitioners have historically focused a lot of their efforts on national and international level policies to try to reduce emissions and mitigate climate change. So we can think about treaties like the Paris Agreement, programs like the Emissions Trading Scheme in Europe, and a bunch of policies that have been adopted by national governments across the globe. Now, unfortunately, the US has not been one of those governments to adopt strong national policies seeking to reduce carbon emissions. We had the failure of Waxman-Markey, which was a prominent failure under the Obama administration. It looks like, sadly, that we are not heading towards strict and substantial climate policy also under the Biden administration. Although I should say that the federal government has played an important role in providing tax credits and investment subsidies for renewable energy, most notably from the stimulus package under Obama. But overall, the federal government has not acted strongly to curb emissions in the US. Now, somewhat surprisingly, given the global nature of the problem, is the response from state governments to this problem. State governments for a long time have played a fundamental role in transitioning their economies away from fossil fuels to renewable sources of power. And for instance, an important policy that state governments have used is the Renewable Portfolio Standard. This is a policy that requires that a certain proportion of the electricity consumed in a state come from renewable sources. These started to pop up in the early 2000s and have been expanded over time. In addition, California in particular has been essential to driving the growth of low emissions and electric vehicles in the US. Certain state governments have adopted carbon pricing. And in recent years, some states have gone beyond RPS programs and carbon pricing to adopt really comprehensive climate and clean energy packages. I'm thinking about places like Colorado and New York. And this is really promising, what state governments have done. Although the conventional view suggests that anything state governments might do on climate is likely to be a drop in the bucket. State governments have limited coverage of the emissions that they can kind of adopt policies that are relevant to. They often have limited administrative capacity relative to the national government. They have often budgetary issues, and the scope of what state governments can do might be restricted by interstate competition. This is kind of the conventional climate federalism view. And this is being challenged, I think, by kind of more research that's showing that state governments can be effective sites of climate policy and that they can enact policy relatively cost effectively that might be effective at reducing emissions. Now, despite these promises, there remain lots of political barriers to the widespread adoption of policies at the state level that would mitigate climate change. Most notably, the fact that these aggressive policies have largely been adopted in states controlled by Democrats. And while these states account for a fairly sizable share, trifecta, these are states where Democrats control the governorship and also state legislatures. These account for a pretty sizable share in terms of the US in terms of population and in terms of GDP. They account for a smaller share of emissions. So there are only so many emissions basically that can be abated through public policy in states that are controlled by Democrats. So this all kind of leads into this question that's been a big focus of my research, which is how can policy leaders in states like California and the Northeast states try to induce policy laggards in other areas of the country and also in the federal government to follow suit. And there's been really three major mechanisms that folks have been talking about by which of interdependencies here across the federal system. So the first is policy learning. This is the idea, using the example of California and Arizona, that California might adopt some renewables policy that appears to be performing well at relatively low cost. This might induce a state like Arizona to learn from that experience in California and be more likely to adopt a similar policy there. A second important mechanism that has been talked about is technological leadership. This is the idea that a state like California, by promoting policies that drive the growth of renewables, this might lead to technological innovations in clean energy or cost declines that then reduce the cost of other states to follow suit through renewables policies, and also potentially allow other states, if you kind of develop these technologies, it might allow other states to decarbonize without adopting their own stringent policies. But the area that I want to talk a lot about today, or a bit about today with the time I have, is an area that I've been working on in my research. And it's thinking about how state policies can build supportive interest group coalitions that might drive subsequent adoption of those policies in other units in our federal system. And this really speaks, I think this is kind of more understudied than the other mechanisms that I've mentioned here, and also speaks to the kind of political barriers to adopting strong climate policies, most notably the opposition of strong and powerful fossil fuel interests. And to kind of get to the framework that I've been working on, I want to talk a little bit about what are known as policy feedback loops, both in kind of broader politics and in climate politics. And this is the idea that the policies that are passed, the policies that governments pass, don't just impact society and the economy. They can also feed back into the political system itself and shape the policies that are adopted in future rounds of politics and policymaking. So these feedbacks can operate strongly in the area of climate and clean energy. And one way this can work is that you might have a clean energy policy like a renewable portfolio standard that increases the growth of low carbon industry, say wind and solar, and reduces the growth of fossil fuel intensive industry. And this is great for long run emissions reductions. But this also has political effects, because if you increase the growth of low carbon industry and reduce the growth of fossil fuel industry, you're also changing who has political power in future round of politics. So a policy that enhances the growth of low carbon industry is going to increase the political power and size of lobbying coalitions that advocate for clean energy policies. And it might reduce the size and political power of lobbying coalitions led by fossil fuel industries that are going to want to oppose clean energy policies. And what I've shown in some of my research is that these types of dynamics don't just operate within particular units of government, but can also operate across sites and levels of government in our federal system. So I want to briefly talk about two papers that I've worked on that illuminate how these dynamics can work. The first thinks about why and how policies promoting the growth of rooftop solar might spread from state to state. And the second thinks about why certain electric utilities, which have historically been pretty strong and important opponents of climate policies, why have some of these utilities kind of coalesced with environmental groups in supporting federal climate policy. So the first case is based on a paper that is published in Perspectives on Politics. And it asks how and why might policies promoting the growth of rooftop solar, say in a state like California, affect the politics of rooftop solar and policy decisions in other states. And I want to start with the observation that over the past 10 years, we've seen pretty strong growth in rooftop solar. This is solar arrays that are connected to distribution grids and sited on people's homes and businesses. This is a model that has grown strongly over the past 10 years and is increasingly kind of challenging the conventional kind of centralized utility-led model of electricity that is the dominant model here. So we've had, but this growth that we've seen over the past 10 years has been far from uniform across the states. And if you look at the states that have had the strongest growth of rooftop solar, some of them are sunny states like Arizona and California, but more importantly, these are states that have policy environments that are conducive to the growth of rooftop solar. These are policy environments where it's cost effective for lots of customers to install rooftop solar and get their power from their roofs versus from utilities and from the grid. So we can think about states like New Jersey and Massachusetts, which don't have particularly sunny environments, but have adopted these policies like net energy metering and other pricing policies that incentivize people to adopt rooftop solar. And if we think in this policy feedback perspective about the political implications of these policies, we can think about how you've had the emergence of rooftop solar companies, installer firms like Sunrun and Solar City, which is now a part of Tesla, whose business model depends on being able to sell systems to customers and install rooftop solar systems on people's homes. And as rooftop solar has grown as part of our energy system, these companies have become more involved in politics. So here I've charted out just the growth of rooftop solar alongside lobbying registrations at the state level from these companies. And you can see that these companies have become kind of an important countervailing force, often opposing electric utilities in policies like net energy metering that affect the growth of rooftop solar. And what I show in the paper is that some of these rooftop solar installers have leveraged their growth in policy, their economic growth in policy leaders like California to increase their lobbying presence in policy laggards and advocate for policies that might allow them to spread from state to state and kind of establish new markets. So an interesting example, I think, of how this can occur is what's happened in South Carolina. So South Carolina was a laggard when it came to rooftop solar until relatively recent years. There was just 3 megawatts of rooftop solar installed as of 2014. This all started to change with the adoption of Act 236 in 2014. And the story of this act, I think, is interesting and illustrative. So initially it was negotiated jointly by environmental groups, clean energy groups, and utilities, and the original version of the bill was not seen as particularly favorable to the development of rooftop solar. Sunrun, the rooftop solar installer company, intervened relatively late in the process and worked with environmental groups that were on the ground to win several pro-rooftop provisions through a lobbying and social media campaign. Sunrun at the time was not operating economically in South Carolina. Rather, they had built their business in states that had previously adopted these pro-rooftop policies, namely in California. Sunrun, so they won the Act 236, which ended up being pretty pro-rooftop, and this led to Sunrun's entrance into the market in mid-2015. They became more politically involved in South Carolina, hiring well-connected conservative lobbyists to represent them in Columbia, South Carolina, and they played an important role coordinating the expansion of the policy, which passed in 2019, despite the opposition from electric utilities, which are generally seen as some of the most powerful actors in state climate and clean energy politics and policy. So the paper, if you're interested in checking it out, also presents some quantitative evidence showing that these dynamics seem to be systematic across companies and across the states. Okay, so now I want to turn to the second case, which thinks about this question of why certain electric utilities, which have historically been opponents of strict climate policies, why certain have kind of worked with environmental groups to support certain climate and clean energy policies. And so you can see in the table here, a bunch of electric utilities supported the Clean Power Plan when it was challenged legally under the Obama administration, and also opposed the Affordable Clean Energy Rule, which was proposed under Trump as a replacement for the Clean Power Plan. So why would these utilities, which have often owned fossil fuel generation and have historically opposed regulations that force them to are potentially costly to them, why would they support these regulations? Well, what my co-author Jonas Meckling and I hypothesize is that a lot of these firms, it seems like, might be responding to the policy environment that they're facing in the states in which they operate, and this might shift their preferences for federal policy. And I'll talk a bit more about why we might expect that to be the case in a minute. But first, I want to mention some quantitative results that we put together, showing that accounting for all these other covariates, the whether utilities operate in states that have previously adopted strict climate policies seems to be strongly associated with whether those utilities support potential federal climate policies, and is also associated with them being less likely to oppose those policies. So to try to tease out kind of some of the reasons why this could be the case, we conducted a bunch of interviews with managers and executives working at electric utilities and found some interesting results. I think the most prominent explanation was that for many utilities operating in liberal-leaning areas, the Clean Power Plan aligned with their existing investment strategies. So these utilities were already making plans to transition to clean energy to comply with state level regulations. So the marginal cost to them of complying with federal regulations was new federal regulations was relatively low or non-existent. Second, some of our interviewees mentioned how for utilities operating in multiple states, having a federal policy as a baseline might offer them a more consistent regulatory landscape and the ability to plan better for the future. Some interviewees mentioned how federal policy they hoped might lead to technological innovation that might reduce the cost of them of complying with strict state policies. And finally, some interviewees discussed how for utilities operating in states with carbon trading, like California, they might benefit from having an expanded permit market through a national policy. Okay, so I just want to now, I've discussed kind of different mechanisms by which state policies might help build their coalition to enact more climate policies down the road in other states at the federal level. And I want to talk a bit about the implications of these ideas for political strategy and policy design. So in terms of political strategy, I think what this suggests is that even though climate change is this problem of global scope, which makes us initially think that we should focus on national and international level solutions, what this framework suggests is that it's important to invest in political capacity and in winning policy victories in multiple jurisdictions, because victories you achieve at one level of government might build your coalition and allow you to subsequently achieve more policy victories in other units or higher level units of government as well. And in terms of policy design, I think this general framework suggests that there might be important sequencing in terms of policy design from carrots to sticks. So if you start with carrots, incentive programs that might grow renewable energy and kind of build your kind of pro-clean energy coalition, it might make it more feasible down the road to adopt policies that actually impose sticks on fossil fuel industry and kind of and might impose some cost on customers to kind of ramp up decarbonization efforts. I think it also suggests the importance in designing policies of providing opportunities for incumbents like electric utilities to make new investments in clean energy, which might kind of bring them to your side in the future, your political coalition, and also try to provide opportunities for new industries like rooftop solar that are likely to be kind of on the pro-climate side of the lobbying coalition in the future as well. So I'll leave it at that, and I thank you very much for your time and for your future questions.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much, Sam, for a great presentation today. And I just wanted to go ahead and actually thank all three of our speakers today. So Zoe Gutman and Melissa Cronin and Samuel Trackman for just a fantastic talk by each of you three. So, and with that, I'm going to go ahead and just give Brooke a second here to go ahead and stop the recording.